A millionaire saw an orphan girl going to school in a torn dress, and when he followed her, he saw something shocking. In the silent and precise routine of Edward Burton, a prestigious businessman in Manchester, days ran like Swiss watches. Always well-dressed, punctual, and emotionally shielded, he lived surrounded by reports, spreadsheets, and corporate decisions that shaped the destiny of hundreds. His world was made of numbers, and feelings were carefully filed away like expired contracts. There was something mechanical about his existence, as if every gesture was measured, every word calculated, every emotion kept under absolute control. Edward was 42 years old, but he seemed to carry a seriousness that aged him beyond his years. His graying hair at the temples gave a distinguished air to his angular face, to his brown eyes that rarely lit up. He wore impeccable suits, designer watches, and always polished shoes. He lived alone in a spacious apartment in Didsbury, with a view of the city he had helped shape through his real estate investments. He was a successful man, recognized, respected, and profoundly lonely. That Thursday morning, as he drove his imported sedan through the tree-lined streets of Manchester, Edward followed his usual route to the office. He had a habit of avoiding main roads, preferring residential neighborhoods where traffic flowed more smoothly. It was a matter of efficiency, he told himself, but perhaps it was also a way to distance himself from the chaos, from the human bustle that bothered him, without him knowing exactly why. It was then that something interrupted his straight line of thought. A girl. She walked with her head down, her steps subdued and her clumsy backpack hanging from one shoulder. She wore a visibly worn pink dress, with frayed fabric edges and a few patches mended with different-colored threads. Her shoes were old, one shoelace loose. Edward glanced at her from the leather seat of his car. But something in that contrast between childlike delicacy and the neglected appearance made him stop at the traffic light and continue watching even after it had turned green. The girl did not lift her eyes. She continued walking with that hunched posture, as if she wanted to occupy the least possible space in the world. There was something unsettling in that image, something Edward couldn't name, but which bothered him throughout his drive to the office. He tried to forget. He immersed himself in the day's meetings, in negotiations, in the numbers that always calmed him. But the image of the girl in the pink dress returned to his mind at unexpected moments, between one spreadsheet and another, between one decision and another. It was as if something in that brief encounter had cracked his emotional armor, allowing a spark of unease to penetrate his meticulously controlled world. The next day, on an impulse he couldn't explain, Edward retraced the same route at the same time, and there she was, crossing the same corner. The pink dress, the clumsy backpack, the downcast walk. He slowed his car, watching her more closely. The girl must have been about 9, or 10, he calculated. She had long unkempt brown hair and fair skin with some spots that looked like sun damage or neglect. She was alone, completely alone. Edward felt something strange tighten in his chest. It wasn't compassion, at least not yet. It was more a kind of discomfort, a feeling that something was wrong with that scene. A child of that age should be accompanied, should be chatting animatedly with other children, should have a livelier, more present gaze. On the third day he parked discreetly on the other side of the street. It was as if something in that image pulled him without permission. His world, so calculated, was beginning to be invaded by an unknown that no chart had predicted. Edward observed himself from outside, questioning what he was doing there, parked on a residential street, watching an unknown child. But he couldn't leave. It was then that he noticed more details. The girl always walked the same way, with slumped shoulders, her gaze fixed on the ground. She didn't carry a snack, didn't have a colorful water bottle like other children. Her backpack seemed too heavy for her small shoulders, and there was something in her expression, even from a distance, that conveyed an ancient sadness, not the fleeting sadness of a child who had argued with a friend or received a bad grade. Edward began to question himself. What was happening to him? Why did that girl affect him so much? He who had built his entire life on the principle of emotional detachment, who avoided involvements, who kept a safe distance from everything and everyone. Why now, at 42, did he find himself disturbed by the image of an unknown child? Perhaps, he thought as he drove back to the office, it was because she reminded him of something. or someone, or perhaps of himself, of the boy he had been, before learning to protect himself from the world through coldness and control. Edward had grown up in a traditional Manchester family. His father was a lawyer, his mother a university professor. There were always books in the house, intellectual conversations at the dinner table, high expectations for his future. He had learned early that showing emotions was a sign of weakness, that crying was unacceptable, that life was a series of achievements to be attained through discipline and reason. Was there love in that family? Perhaps. But it was an austere, formal love, expressed through demands and conditional approvals. When Edward was 15, he fell in love for the first time. She was a girl from school, with green eyes and a wide smile. He wrote letters, bought flowers, left notes in her locker, and he was publicly rejected, in front of the entire class, with laughter and mockery that echoed through the corridors. That day, something inside him closed off. He decided he would never again allow himself to be vulnerable, never again surrender his heart to something or someone who could hurt him. Since then, Edward built his life as if it were a company. He studied business administration, earned an MBA, and opened his own business at 25. He had relationships, yes, but always superficial, always with an expiration date, always keeping a part of himself inaccessible. He married at 30 to an elegant and ambitious woman like himself. The marriage lasted 5 years and ended civilly, without major dramas, just the mutual realization that there was nothing there beyond convenience. After that, Edward delved even deeper into work. His company grew, prospered, becoming a benchmark in Manchester's real estate market. He bought, sold, developed projects, moved millions, and he felt empty. But it was a familiar emptiness, even comfortable. Better to feel nothing than to feel pain. Until that morning. Until that girl in the pink dress. The following week, Edward found himself purposely altering his routine to pass by that same street every day. He wouldn't admit to himself what he was doing. But there he was, punctually, at 7:30 in the morning, watching the girl walk towards school. He began to notice patterns. She was always alone, she never smiled. She carried the same worn backpack. And the pink dress, which seemed to be the only one she had, was increasingly faded. One day, when the traffic light turned red right beside her, Edward discreetly lowered his car window. He managed to hear her whisper something to herself, a soft tune that sounded more like a lament than a song. Her voice was sweet, but there was a fragility in it that broke his heart. Edward felt a pang in his chest. It was as if all the armor he had built over the years was being pierced by that fragile little voice, by that image, full of abandonment and loneliness. He, who had always prided himself on his ability to stay distant, not to get involved, not to care, now found himself obsessed with a child he didn't even know. He then decided he needed to know more. He could no longer ignore that growing unease, that feeling that something was very wrong, and that he, in some way, needed to understand what. He started discreetly. He asked the doorman of the commercial building near the school if he knew the girl. The man, a middle-aged gentleman named Mr. Augustus, nodded. "Yes, I know her, sir. That's Olivia. Poor thing, always alone around here. She studies at the state school just around the corner." Olivia. Now the girl had a name, and having a name made her even more real, even more present in Edward's mind. "Do her parents work a lot?" Edward asked, trying to sound casual. Mr. Augustus looked around and lowered his voice. "No parents, sir. The girl is an orphan. She lives with a woman nearby. They say she's her guardian, Mrs. Sandra, an elegant woman, always well-dressed. But the girl, look, always neglected like that. I've never seen her in new clothes, never seen her accompanied at school. It's strange, you know." Edward felt his stomach clench. Orphan. The word echoed in his mind with painful weight. That child had already lost so much, and yet she seemed so abandoned, so neglected. He began to observe more closely. He discovered where Olivia studied, a public school 3 blocks away. He also started passing by at dismissal time just to see her leave, and what he saw disturbed him more and more. Olivia rarely interacted with other children. She always stayed apart, sitting alone on the low school wall, waiting. Waiting for what? For whom? One afternoon, Edward saw Olivia drop some papers from her backpack. She bent down to pick them up, but the wind scattered some across the ground. Edward quickly parked and went to help, retrieving the papers before they blew into the street. As he handed them to the girl, their eyes met for the first time. What he saw in those childlike eyes deeply shook him. There was none of the vivacity, curiosity, or joy one expects to see in a child's eyes. There was weariness, there was fear, there was a sadness so profound that it seemed impossible to fit into such a small being. "Thank you," Olivia whispered, taking the papers back and quickly stuffing them into her backpack. Edward stood paralyzed, watching her walk away with that downcast gait. When he finally managed to move, he was already in his car. But before leaving, he looked at the paper he still held in his hand. Without realizing it, he had kept one of Olivia's drawings. When he opened it in the office later, a shiver ran down his spine. The drawing was disturbing. Trembling figures with hands floating in space, a house without doors, eyes without faces. It wasn't just child art. There was something screaming there, unspoken but clearly felt. It was a silent cry, a mute accusation from a child who had no voice. Edward put the drawing in his desk drawer, but he couldn't get it out of his head. That night, for the first time in years, he had trouble sleeping. He lay staring at his bedroom ceiling, thinking about that girl in the pink dress, those sad eyes, that disturbing drawing. Something inside him was changing. The armor was cracking, and he didn't know if this was good or dangerous, whether he should embrace this transformation or flee from it while he still could. The next day, Edward made a decision. He needed to know more about Olivia. He needed to understand what was happening to that child. And perhaps, just perhaps, he needed to admit to himself that after years of protecting himself from the world, after years of living in his bubble of control and emotional distance, something had finally managed to penetrate his defenses. She was a 9-year-old girl in a pink dress with sad eyes, and she was changing everything. Edward began his investigation discreetly. He used his contacts, his connections in the city. He discovered that Olivia had lost her parents at the age of 6, in a terrible accident he preferred not to imagine in detail. Since then, she had been living under the guardianship of Sandra Lane, who claimed to be a close family friend. But the more Edward investigated, the more questions arose. Sandra Lane was a woman of impeccable appearance, always well-dressed, made up, with perfectly styled hair. She drove a luxury car, lived in a large house in Alderley Edge. She attended social events, participated in charitable organizations. Outwardly, she was the picture of respectability. But then why did Olivia wear old clothes? Why was she always alone, always neglected? Why did she have that dull gaze, that weight on her shoulders? Edward spoke with the school principal, introducing himself as a potential sponsor interested in helping vulnerable children. The woman, a lady in her 50s named Marlene, was visibly excited by the possibility of receiving financial support. "We have several children who could benefit," she explained. "Olivia, for example, a sweet, intelligent girl but so withdrawn. She never talks about her home life. Her schoolwork is good, but she always seems so tired, so distant." "Do you know her guardian?" Edward asked. Mrs. Marlene hesitated. "I know Mrs. Sandra, yes. She comes here occasionally, always very polite, always concerned with keeping up appearances. But I confess it bothers me. Olivia always comes in the same clothes, never brings a proper snack, never has new supplies. And when I ask Mrs. Sandra about it, she always has a ready excuse. She says the girl is stubborn, that she doesn't want to wear the new clothes she buys, that she loses her supplies. But I see Olivia's eyes when she hears these lies, and I know they are lies." Edward felt anger rise in his chest. How could someone do that to a child? How could they use a vulnerable orphan, take advantage of her fragility, her inability to defend herself? But he needed more than indignation. He needed proof. He needed to understand exactly what was happening before he could act. It was then that he met Mrs. Nora, a lady who ran the canteen at a nearby school. She recognized him one day when he was observing Olivia from a distance and discreetly approached him. "You've noticed it, too, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low and filled with concern. Edward turned, surprised. "Noticed what?" "That something is very wrong with that girl. I met Olivia when she arrived here, right after losing her parents. She was a child full of life, loving, talkative. always smiling, always wanting to help. And look what she's become. Dull, frightened, as if she's learned it's safer not to exist. Edward felt a lump in his throat. You think she's being mistreated? Mrs. Nora looked around before answering. I think that child is suffering in a way we can't even imagine, but Mrs. Sandra is clever. She knows how to keep up appearances. She knows what to say, how to present herself. And Olivia has learned to stay quiet. Children like that, when they learn that asking for help is useless, when they learn that complaining only makes things worse, they simply give up. And it's the saddest thing in the world. That night, Edward barely slept. He kept thinking about Olivia, about that girl who had learned to give up before she even had a chance to live. He thought about his own childhood, the times he felt alone even when surrounded by people, the times he had to swallow emotions because showing them was unacceptable. But what he had experienced was nothing compared to what Olivia was facing. He had had a home, food, education. He had had present parents, even if emotionally distant. Olivia had lost everything, and now she was in the hands of someone who seemed to be using her suffering for some obscure purpose. Edward looked at the drawing he had kept, the hands floating in space, the house without doors, the eyes without faces. It was as if Olivia was saying she had no one to cling to, nowhere to run, no one who truly saw her. But she was wrong, because he saw her, and he could no longer look away. For the first time in decades, Edward Burton felt something other than emptiness. He felt purpose. He felt anger. He felt determination. Something within him which had been dormant for so long was awakening, and he knew with a certainty he couldn't explain that his life would never be the same again. The following days turned into a journey of discoveries Edward had never imagined living. Each morning, he woke with Olivia's image in his mind. Each night he slept thinking about how he could help her. His impeccable routine, which for years had been his safe haven, now seemed insignificant compared to the urgency he felt to understand what was happening to that girl. Edward began to frequent the neighborhood where Olivia lived. Discreetly he observed Sandra Lane's house, a spacious and well-maintained building with a blooming garden and an electronic gate. Everything there exuded prosperity and order, but the more he observed, the more he noticed the contradictions. Sandra came and went in expensive clothes, designer bags, always on the phone, dealing with business. Olivia, on the other hand, was seen only during school hours, always in the same worn clothes, always alone. It was on a cold and rainy morning that Edward witnessed something that deeply disturbed him. He was parked a safe distance away when he saw Olivia arrive at school completely soaked. Her pink dress was drenched, clinging to her small body. She was visibly trembling, but there was no natural discomfort in her expression. It was as if she had grown accustomed to it, as if getting wet in the rain, feeling cold, being neglected was just another normal day in her life. Minutes later, Sandra arrived in her imported car. She stepped out with an elegant umbrella, high heels, intact makeup, not a drop of rain on her clothes. She took Olivia by the arm with a firmness that seemed excessive, without even trying to dry her or show concern for her state. She led her to the school entrance and greeted the principal with a cold smile, thanking her for her support with the girl's education. Edward watched everything from inside his car, feeling indignation grow like a wave. How was it possible that this woman left home dry and comfortable while leaving a child in her care to get completely soaked? How did no one question this? How did people not see what he was seeing? But then he remembered Mrs. Marlene's and Mrs. Nora's words. Sandra knew how to keep up appearances. She knew what to say, how to present herself. And a traumatized child who has learned to stay quiet doesn't denounce her tormentors. She merely survives. Edward then decided he needed to approach more directly. He needed to speak with Sandra, observe her closely, understand whom he was dealing with. But he knew he needed to be strategic. If she perceived his intentions, she could close off completely, or worse, could harm Olivia even more. A few days later, he created an opportunity. There was a charity event in the city, organized by one of the institutions Sandra was part of. Edward, as a well-known businessman, easily obtained an invitation. He went prepared, wearing his best suit, adopting the professional demeanor he knew so well. He saw her right at the entrance. Sandra Lane was a woman of approximately 40, tall, slender, with dyed blonde hair and a studiedly elegant posture. She wore a designer black dress, discreet but expensive jewelry, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. There was something calculated in every movement she made, as if she were constantly performing for an invisible audience. Edward approached during the cocktail, introducing himself as a businessman interested in social projects. Sandra received him with professional enthusiasm, speaking about the various causes she supported, the ongoing projects, her dedication to helping the less fortunate. Her words were beautiful, well-articulated, convincing. But Edward, who had spent decades reading people in negotiations, perceived the falsehood behind every sentence. They talked for a few minutes about generalities. Then, calculatingly, Edward mentioned that he had seen a very sweet girl near the neighborhood school, a little girl in a pink dress who always seemed so alone. Did she know of any institution that could help vulnerable children? Sandra's reaction was almost imperceptible, but Edward caught it, a slight stiffening of her smile, a different glint in her eyes. She knew exactly whom he was talking about. "Ah, that must be Olivia," she replied, with a soft but controlled voice. "She's my ward. Poor thing, she lost her parents when she was so young. I do what I can for her, but you know how these children are. Stubborn, difficult. They don't want to accept help, they don't want to wear the clothes I buy for them. She prefers that old little dress, says it was her mother's. I don't have the heart to take it away, it's all she has left of her memories." The story was convincing, almost perfect, but Edward perceived the skillfully woven lie. He saw how Sandra averted her gaze when speaking, how her hands nervously moved with the wine glass. She was lying, and doing so with an ease that indicated practice. "What a difficult situation," Edward commented, maintaining a neutral tone. "You're doing admirable work. It must be challenging to care for a traumatized child." Sandra sighed dramatically. "It's a sacrifice, I won't lie. But I promised her parents before they passed that I would take care of the girl. It's the least I can do." Another lie. Edward had investigated. Sandra barely knew Olivia's parents. There was no promise at all. There was only guardianship obtained suspiciously, a few months after the tragedy. He tried to ask more questions, but Sandra skillfully diverted, changing the subject, introducing him to other people. Her intention to end that conversation was clear. Edward didn't insist. He had gotten what he wanted. Now he was absolutely certain that Sandra was hiding something. But what? In the following days, Edward intensified his observations. He began to notice unusual movements within his own company as well. Financial reports were passing through unauthorized hands. Confidential documents seemed to have been accessed. And then he discovered something that put him on alert. A man named Brian Lane had recently been hired as an administrative assistant. The surname was already suspicious, but Edward needed to be sure. He investigated and discovered that Brian was Sandra's brother, and that, coincidentally or not, he had started working at his company precisely during the period when Edward had begun to show interest in Olivia's case. The pieces of a twisted puzzle began to fit together. A woman who suddenly appeared with an orphan child, a man infiltrated in his company, silent financial movements, and a girl who drew what she couldn't verbalize. Edward summoned the human resources director and asked for discreet access to Brian Lane's history. What he found was disturbing. Brian had a murky past, with several job changes in a short period, always in administrative positions where he would have access to financial information. There was never anything provenly illegal, but the pattern was clear. At the same time, Edward received information from his accountant about subtle irregularities in the company's accounts. Nothing alarming, but small amounts being transferred to accounts he didn't recognize. When he investigated further, he discovered that some of these accounts were linked to shell companies, and one of them had Sandra Lane as a partner. The scenario became clearer and more sordid. Sandra and Brian were not simply negligent people, mistreating a child. They were calculating manipulators using Olivia as part of some larger scheme. But exactly how and why? It was then that Edward received something unexpected, An envelope appeared on his desk in the office. There was no sender, no explanatory note, just a drawing inside. It was from Olivia. He recognized the trembling line, the childlike style laden with emotion. But this drawing was even more disturbing than the previous one. It showed a girl behind grey-colored bars and a blue tear streaming from an enormous, disproportionately large eye. In the bottom corner of the page, the delicate, childlike signature, O. Edward felt his heart race. How had that drawing reached him? Who had left it? Could it have been Olivia herself? But how would she know where he worked? He carefully put the drawing away and decided he needed help. He couldn't do this alone anymore. He needed someone who knew Olivia closely, someone who could provide information without raising suspicion. It was then that he remembered Patricia Miller. She had been mentioned by Mrs. Marlene as the mother of one of Olivia's classmates and president of the school's parent association. Edward sought her out, introducing himself as a businessman interested in making donations for educational projects. Patricia, a woman in her 30s, a literature teacher and dedicated mother, received him sympathetically. They initially talked about generalities, about the school, about the challenges of public education. Then carefully Edward mentioned Olivia. He said he had noticed that the girl seemed very lonely, very sad, and that he would like to know if there was any way to help her. Patricia hesitated. She looked around as if checking if anyone could hear them. Then, in a low voice, she began to speak. "Mr. Edward, I don't know exactly what's happening with that child, but there's something very wrong. My daughter, Sophia, has tried several times to be Olivia's friend, but the girl is so withdrawn, so frightened." One day, Sophia found her crying in the school bathroom. When she asked what had happened, Olivia said she was just missing someone who couldn't come back. Edward felt a tightness in his chest. She must be talking about her parents. Patricia shook her head slowly. "I thought so too. But the way she spoke was strange. Sophia said it seemed like Olivia was talking about someone alive, not someone who had passed away. And she was scared." Sophia noticed the fear in her eyes. "And the guardian, what do the other mothers say about her?" Patricia sighed. "Mrs. Sandra is a mystery. She's always so polite, so well presented, so involved in the school's charitable activities. But there's something about her that bothers me. It's like a performance, and the way she treats Olivia in public is strange. I've never seen a genuine gesture of affection. It's always very formal, very controlled, and the girl gets so tense when she appears." "Does anyone else notice this?" Edward asked. "Some mothers comment, yes, but no one dares to openly question it. Mrs. Sandra has influence, she's well connected, and without concrete proof, what can we do? Report based on what? On a feeling, on a sense that something is wrong." Edward understood the dilemma. It was exactly what he was facing. He knew something was profoundly wrong, but he still didn't have solid enough proof to act. "Patricia, can I count on your help?" he asked directly. "I need to better understand what's happening. I need to protect this girl." Patricia looked him in the eyes, assessing his sincerity. Then she nodded. "Yes, you can. I also want to help Olivia. I always have. I just didn't know how." In the days that followed, Patricia became a valuable ally. Through her, Edward obtained more detailed information about Olivia's routine at school. He learned that the girl rarely participated in group activities, that she remained isolated during recess, that her notebooks were filled with disturbing drawings in the margins. One day, Patricia brought something that deeply shook Edward. It was an audio recording accidentally made by her daughter Sophia on her cell phone. The girl had left the phone recording while playing with friends in the schoolyard and inadvertently captured a conversation between Sandra and Olivia. In the recording, Sandra's cold voice could be heard reprimanding Olivia. The words were harsh, cutting like blades. "You're nothing but dead weight in this house. No one wanted you, no one wants you. You should be grateful to have a roof over your head, to have food on the table, but instead you sit there with that abandoned dog face, making people feel sorry for you." Olivia's voice, small and trembling, almost inaudible. "Sorry, Aunt Sandra. Don't call me Aunt. I'm nothing to you. I'm just the idiot who agreed to keep you for a while." But don't get too comfortable. As soon as I get what I need, you'll be far away from here." Edward felt rage explode in his chest. His hands trembled as he held the phone. That was emotional abuse, clear and cruel. How could someone speak like that to a child? How could she be so inhumane? Patricia was visibly shaken as well. "I listened to that recording and couldn't sleep all night. What do we do with this? Is it proof of anything? Can we use it?" Edward took a deep breath, trying to control his fury. "It's a start, but I need more. I need to understand her plan. What did she mean by get what I need?" He spent the following days gathering information like pieces of a macabre puzzle. He discovered, through his contacts, that Sandra had tried to access the inheritance left by Olivia's parents. It was a considerable sum, held in a trust fund that could only be accessed when Olivia turned 18 or with court authorization in exceptional cases. Sandra had tried to obtain this authorization, claiming she needed the money to adequately care for the girl. But the request had been denied by the judge, who asked for more documentation and social follow-up. Since then, Sandra seemed to be trying other approaches, including the creation of companies in Olivia's name to which she, as legal guardian, had access. And that's when everything started to make sense to Edward. Sandra wasn't taking care of Olivia out of kindness or a promise. She was using the girl as a means to access her inheritance. And Brian, infiltrated in companies where he could manipulate documents and accounts, was an essential part of this scheme. But there was still something darker in this story. Edward discovered through a conversation with Mrs. Nora that there was a letter left by Olivia's mother before the tragedy, mentioning that if anything happened to her and her husband, Olivia should stay with her maternal grandmother, who lived in a small town in rural Cheshire. "Where is this grandmother now?" Edward asked. Mrs. Nora lowered her eyes, visibly disturbed. "They say she vanished. Soon after the tragedy, she tried to contact Olivia, wanted to take her to live with her. But Mrs. Sandra had already obtained guardianship. And then the grandmother simply disappeared. No one knows where she went, no one heard from her. It's as if she evaporated." A shiver ran down Edward's spine. What could have happened to Olivia's grandmother? Had she been threatened, driven away, or something worse? He needed to find out. He discreetly hired a private investigator, a trusted man who had worked for him on delicate corporate cases before. He asked him to locate Olivia's grandmother to find out what had happened to her. While awaiting results, Edward continued observing Olivia, and what he saw broke him more and more. The girl was visibly worse, thinner, paler, with deep, dark circles under her eyes that shouldn't exist on a child's face. Her drawings, which Patricia occasionally obtained through her daughter Sophia, became increasingly dark. Cracked houses, headless dolls, a man with erased features and hands extended in threatening gestures. Edward kept each drawing as evidence, but also as a painful reminder of that child's suffering. Every trembling line was a silent scream that no one was hearing, except him. One Friday afternoon, while organizing the documents he had gathered about Sandra and Brian, Edward noticed something. There was a pattern in the dates. The suspicious transfers from his company, the movements in Sandra's shell accounts, the attempts to access Olivia's inheritance. Everything happened in cycles, as if there were a schedule. He called his accountant and asked for a more detailed analysis. What he discovered was frightening. Sandra and Brian were systematically diverting small amounts from various sources, including Edward's company, donations supposedly intended for charitable institutions, and funds that should have been used to care for Olivia. It was a sophisticated scheme, carefully planned not to raise individual suspicions. But when summed, the amounts were significant, and everything indicated that they were preparing for a bigger hit. Probably waiting for the right moment to access Olivia's inheritance once and for all. Edward felt nauseous. That child was not just neglected. She was being systematically used, exploited, kept in a state of vulnerability as part of a broader criminal plan. And he, who throughout his life had remained distant, detached, emotionally shielded, now found himself at the center of a situation that demanded not just his attention, but his entire heart. He looked at Olivia's most recent drawing, the one that showed the girl between two doors. On one side, the shadow of a threatening woman. On the other, an outstretched hand without a face but with a silver ring, just like the one he wore on his right ring finger. Did Olivia know he was there? Had that frightened and traumatized child in some way realized that someone was finally seeing her suffering, was trying to help? Edward carefully put the drawing away and made a decision. He would no longer just observe and gather information. It was time to act. But he needed to do it carefully, strategically. One wrong step and he could put Olivia at even greater risk. That night, for the first time in many years, Edward prayed. He wasn't sure if he believed in God, he wasn't sure if his prayers would be heard. But he asked for strength, he asked for wisdom, he asked for protection for that girl in the pink dress who had turned his world upside down. And he swore to himself that he would not rest until Olivia was safe, until her smile returned, until those sad eyes regained the light every child deserves to have. The week began with a call from the private investigator. Edward answered anxiously, hoping to finally have answers about Olivia's grandmother's whereabouts. What he heard, however, left him even more disturbed. "Mr. Burton, I found Mrs. Carmen Scott, the girl's maternal grandmother. She's alive, living in a care home in Knutsford. But there's something very strange about all of this." Edward leaned forward in his chair, attentive to every word. "What did you discover?" "Well, Mrs. Carmen was admitted to this care home about 2 years ago, right after the tragedy with her granddaughter's parents. She was trying to obtain guardianship of Olivia, when suddenly she began to show symptoms of senile dementia. She was quickly diagnosed, deemed incapable of caring for a child, and admitted." "And what's the strange part?" Edward pressed. The investigator hesitated before continuing. "I spoke with the medical team, discreetly. They said that when Mrs. Carmen arrived, she was indeed confused, disoriented. But over time, she significantly improved. Today, she is lucid most of the time. She talks about her granddaughter constantly, asks about her, says she was prevented from seeing her. But no one pays attention. After all, she's already been diagnosed with dementia." Edward felt his anger grow. Did someone misdiagnose her? Or was it something worse? "I can't say for sure, but I discovered something interesting. The doctor who made the initial diagnosis has professional ties to a clinician who treats the Lane family, and the costs of the care home are being paid by a shell company which, guess what, has Sandra Lane as a hidden partner." The picture became clearer and more macabre. Sandra had not only removed Olivia's rightful guardian, but had possibly manipulated a medical diagnosis to keep her away. And she was paying for the admission to ensure that Mrs. Carmen stayed far from her granddaughter, unable to interfere with her plans. Edward thanked the investigator and asked him to continue monitoring the situation. He then sat in his office, looking out the window at the city of Manchester below. How many stories of suffering silently unfolded while people went about their normal lives? How many children were being exploited, mistreated, forgotten? He had never cared before. He always believed that everyone should take care of their own problems, that he had no responsibility for others' suffering. But now, with Olivia's face constantly in his mind, with her disturbing drawings scattered across his desk, Edward understood that this indifference had merely been a way to protect himself, to not feel, to not get involved, to not risk his heart. But it was too late to turn back. His heart was already deeply involved. That afternoon, Edward received a visit from Patricia Miller in his office. She seemed agitated, worried. "Mr. Edward, I need to speak with you about something that happened at school today." He invited her to sit and offered her water. Patricia took a few sips before beginning to speak. "There was an incident at lunchtime. Olivia fainted in the cafeteria. The teachers were scared. They called the school nurse. When they tried to revive her, they realized she was extremely thin, dehydrated. It seems she hadn't been eating properly for weeks." Edward felt his stomach churn. "Is she okay now?" "She woke up after a few minutes, but she was weak, confused. The principal called Mrs. Sandra, asking her to come pick up the girl and take her to a doctor. Do you know what she said?" "What?" that she was too busy, that she would send someone to pick up the girl later. She didn't even bother to come personally. Sandra's coldness was terrifying. How could someone be so inhumane? How could she treat a child under her responsibility with such disregard? "And was the girl taken to a doctor?" Edward asked. Patricia shook her head negatively. "Not that I know of. When I left school at 5 o'clock, Olivia was still in the infirmary waiting. The secretary said that Mrs. Sandra sent a message saying she could only pick up the girl at the end of the day." Edward looked at his watch. It was 6 in the evening. He made an impulsive decision. "I'm going to pick her up." Patricia's eyes widened. "You? But the school won't allow it. You're not a relative, not a legal guardian." Edward was already grabbing his car keys. "Then I'll wait outside until someone picks her up. I won't leave that girl alone." He drove to the school quickly. When he arrived, it was almost night. Most of the staff had left. Only the secretary and a teacher remained, accompanying Olivia in the infirmary. Edward parked in front and waited. He constantly watched the entrance, expecting to see Sandra arrive. But the minutes passed and nothing. At 7:30, the secretary came out to check if anyone was waiting. Edward got out of his car and approached. "Good evening, I'm Edward Burton. I'm here concerned about the girl who felt unwell today. Has her guardian not arrived yet?" The secretary, a middle-aged woman with a tired expression, sighed. "No, sir. And I need to leave. My son is alone at home. Miss Julia is staying with the girl, but she also has commitments." "Can I help in any way?" Edward offered. "Can I call the guardian? Insist that she come?" The secretary hesitated, but then nodded. "That would be very kind. Here's her number." Edward called. Sandra answered with an irritated voice. "Hello? Mrs. Sandra, this is Edward Burton. I'm at the school where Olivia studies. Do you know she felt unwell today?" There was a pause. "Yes, I know. And who are you to be meddling in this?" "I'm someone concerned about a child's well-being. The girl has been waiting for hours. She's weak. She needs medical attention. Are you coming to pick her up?" Sandra's voice turned icy. "Look here, Mr. Edward. I don't know who you think you are, but I suggest you worry about your own life and leave mine alone. I'll pick up Olivia when I can, and if you keep meddling where you're not invited, I'll take legal action." And she hung up. Edward stared at the phone, incredulous. The woman had not an ounce of concern for Olivia. Nothing. It was pure coldness, pure self-interest. He went back to the secretary and lied. "She said she's on her way. Can I wait with the girl until she arrives?" The secretary seemed relieved. "Oh, that's good. Then I'll let Miss Julia know she can go. Do you mind staying?" "Not at all. I'll stay as long as necessary." The secretary and the teacher left, leaving Edward alone in the empty school. He entered the infirmary and for the first time was alone with Olivia. The girl was lying on a narrow cot covered with a thin blanket. Her eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling. She looked so small, so fragile, so lost. Edward approached slowly, so as not to scare her. "Hi, Olivia. My name is Edward. I came to wait with you until your guardian arrives." Olivia slowly turned her face towards him. Her eyes, large and brown, observed him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "I know you," she said, in a weak voice. "You're the man in the silver car." Edward felt his heart clench. She had noticed him. During all those weeks when he thought he was observing discreetly, she knew of his presence. "That's true. I pass by here sometimes." "You keep looking at me," Olivia accused, but without hostility, merely stating a fact. Edward didn't know what to say. How to explain to a 9-year-old child that he had become obsessed with understanding her suffering, with helping her. "I'm worried about you," he said honestly. "You always seem so alone, so sad." Olivia continued looking at him, assessing. "Everyone keeps looking, but no one does anything." The sentence was like a punch to Edward's gut. She was right. How many people had noticed her suffering and simply moved on? How many had been moved for an instant and then forgotten? "I want to do something," Edward said, his voice laden with emotion. "I want to help you, but I need to understand what's happening. Can you tell me?" Olivia averted her gaze, fixing it on the ceiling again. For a long moment she remained silent. Edward thought she wouldn't answer, but then, in a voice so low that he had to lean in to hear, she began to speak. "Aunt Sandra isn't mean, she just doesn't like me. She says I'm a burden, that I should be grateful. And I am. I try to be. But it's never enough." Edward felt tears burn his eyes. He forced himself to keep his voice calm. "You're not a burden, Olivia. You're a child. You deserve to be cared for, to be loved." Olivia gave a sad smile, too mature for her age. "My parents loved me, but they went away, and now I have no one." "You have. Your grandmother," Edward gently reminded her. Olivia's eyes filled with tears. "Grandma Carmen? She went away too. Aunt Sandra said she got sick, that she can't take care of me anymore, that it's better if I don't even think about her." More manipulation, more cruelty. Edward took a deep breath, trying to control his anger. "What if I told you that your grandmother hasn't forgotten about you, that she's well and thinks about you every day?" Olivia looked at him with a mixture of hope and fear. "Is it true?" "It is, and I'll do everything I can to make sure you can see each other soon." Tears began to stream down Olivia's face. She made no sound, just cried silently, as if she had learned that crying loudly was not allowed. Edward, without thinking, reached out and gently wiped her tears with his thumb. The gesture was so natural, so paternal, that it surprised him. He, who had never wanted children, who had always avoided deep emotional involvement, now felt such an intense protective love for that girl he barely knew. Olivia didn't pull away from the touch. Instead, she closed her eyes as if that simple gesture of kindness was something she hadn't received in a long time. They stayed like that for a few minutes in silence. Then Olivia whispered something that completely broke Edward's heart. "Why do you care? No one cares. I care because you matter, because every child matters, and because, in a way I can't explain, you reminded me that I also have a heart, and that it's worth using." Olivia opened her eyes and looked at him with an intensity that seemed impossible from someone so young. "Are you really going to help me, or are you going to give up like everyone else?" Edward held her small hand in his. "I promise I will help you, and I never break my promises." At that moment, Edward knew he was making more than a promise to a child. He was making a vow to himself, a declaration that he would no longer be the cold and distant man he had been, that he would risk everything, his comfort, his security, perhaps even his reputation, to save that girl. Sandra arrived almost 2 hours later. She entered the infirmary with irritated steps, her high heels echoing in the empty corridor. "Olivia, get up, let's go. You've caused enough trouble for today." Olivia immediately flinched, all the sparkle that had appeared in her eyes during the conversation with Edward vanishing. She quickly stood up, grabbed her backpack, and lowered her head. Edward placed himself between Sandra and the door. "The girl needs medical attention. She fainted. She's malnourished." Sandra looked at him with disdain. "And since when are you a doctor, or her father, or anything other than a busybody?" "I'm someone who cares about a child's well-being." "How touching, but it's none of your business. Olivia is under my legal guardianship, and if you keep interfering, I'll contact my lawyers." "Do that," Edward calmly replied, "and I'll contact mine. And I'll also contact Child Protective Services and the police, and any authority that can investigate how a child under your responsibility is being so visibly neglected." Sandra's eyes gleamed with anger, but also with a flicker of fear. "You don't know who you're messing with, and you don't know whom you're dealing with," Edward retorted. "I've been a businessman for 20 years. I have resources, contacts, and most importantly, I have determination, and I'm going to use all of it to ensure Olivia is protected." Sandra grabbed Olivia's arm too tightly. "Come on, girl." Olivia looked at Edward one last time, her eyes pleading for help, but also resigned, as if she was already accustomed to seeing adults talk about protecting her, but never actually doing anything. Edward watched the two leave, feeling helplessness and anger in equal measure, but also determination, because now, after having spoken directly with Olivia, after having seen her suffering up close, there was no turning back. He was going to save that girl, whatever the cost. The next day, Edward woke up earlier than usual. He had a plan. First, He was going to hire the best lawyers specializing in child and adolescent law. Second, he was going to gather all the evidence he had collected. Third, he was going to contact Child Protective Services and file a formal complaint. But before anything else, he needed to visit someone. He needed to personally meet Mrs. Carmen, Olivia's grandmother, who had been unjustly separated from her granddaughter. He drove to Knutsford, a journey of approximately an hour and a half. The care home was a beautiful, well-maintained place, but Edward knew that behind that pleasant facade there was a prisoner, a woman who had been medicated and incorrectly diagnosed to be kept away from the granddaughter she loved. He introduced himself as a family friend and asked to visit Mrs. Carmen. The receptionist hesitated, but Edward used all his charm and persuasion. Finally, he was led to an internal garden where Mrs. Carmen was sitting on a bench, feeding the birds. She was a woman of approximately 70, with completely white hair pulled back in a bun, blue eyes still lively despite her age, and a face that, despite the wrinkles, retained traces of an ancient beauty. There was a dignity about her that even the unjust situation she was in could not erase. "Mrs. Carmen, my name is Edward Burton. I came to speak with you about your granddaughter, Olivia." The effect was immediate. Carmen dropped the handful of seeds she was holding and looked at Edward with wide eyes full of hope and fear. "Olivia? You know my Olivia? How is she? Is she well? Please, tell me she's well." Edward sat beside her, carefully choosing his words. "Olivia is alive, but she's not well. I need your help to understand what happened. Why are you here? Why were you separated from her?" Carmen began to cry, silent tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "They separated me. That woman, Sandra, she conspired against me. When my daughter and son-in-law passed away in that terrible accident, I wanted to take care of Olivia. It was my right, my obligation. But Sandra appeared with papers saying she had been appointed guardian. I contested it, sought lawyers, and then I started to get sick." "Sick how?" Edward asked, though he already knew the answer. "Dizziness, mental confusion, forgetfulness. I went to the doctor. He diagnosed me with advanced senile dementia. He said I was unfit to care for a child, that I needed to be institutionalized. Everything happened so fast. One moment I was fighting for my granddaughter's custody. The next, I was here, classified as incapacitated. And now? How are you now?" Carmen looked at him with crystal-clear lucidity. "I'm perfectly fine. The symptoms disappeared months after I stopped taking the medication that doctor had prescribed. I tried to tell the staff here. I tried to leave. But they say I need medical authorization, that the diagnosis is in my records. I'm practically a prisoner." Edward felt the confirmation of what he already suspected. Sandra had poisoned or incorrectly medicated Carmen to simulate dementia, thus ensuring she was removed and institutionalized, unable to interfere with her plans for Olivia. "Mrs. Carmen, I'm going to be honest with you. Olivia is being mistreated. She is being neglected, emotionally abused, used as part of a scheme to access the inheritance left by her parents. And I need your help to get her out of this situation." Carmen grabbed Edward's hands with surprising strength for her age. "Do whatever is necessary. Use my testimonies, my medical records, anything. Just get my girl out of that terrible woman's hands. Please." Edward nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "I will do that, I promise. But it will take time. I need to gather enough evidence. I need to do everything correctly so that Sandra cannot contest it. Can you be patient? I've waited 2 years for this chance. I can wait a little longer if it means I'll finally have my granddaughter back." Edward spent hours talking with Carmen, noting everything she said, asking her to write detailed testimonies about everything that had happened. He also obtained copies of her medical records, which would show inconsistencies in the diagnosis. When he finally said goodbye to her, promising to return soon with news, Edward knew he had powerful ammunition against Sandra, but he also knew he needed to act fast. The longer Olivia spent under that roof, the more psychological damage she would suffer. On the way back to Manchester, his phone rang. It was Patricia. "Edward, I need to speak with you urgently. Something happened at school today, something very bad." Edward sped up the car, his heart pounding. Patricia's voice on the phone was laden with urgency and concern. What happened? Patricia, there was an event at school today, a presentation for parents. All the children were accompanied by family members, except Olivia. She appeared alone, wearing that pink dress, now even more worn, almost in rags. The other children laughed, made mean comments. And Olivia, Edward, she had a breakdown. She started trembling, crying. She panicked. It was horrible. Edward felt his throat tighten. Where is she now? The nurse took her to the restroom. Mrs. Sandra was called, but she hasn't arrived yet. Edward, this girl is breaking. She can't take it anymore. We need to do something. And fast. I'm on my way. I'll stay with her until I can sort this out once and for all. When he arrived at the school, 20 minutes later, he found Olivia in the same infirmary where he had seen her days before. But this time she was different. She wasn't just sad or resigned. She was crumbling. The girl was huddled in a corner, clutching an old mended teddy bear that Edward had never seen her carry before. She swayed back and forth, murmuring something incomprehensible, tears streaming down her face without her seeming to notice. Edward approached, slowly as he would approach a wounded animal. "Olivia, it's me, Edward. Do you remember me?" The girl looked up. Her eyes were empty, distant, as if she had retreated to some place within herself where pain couldn't reach her. "They laughed at me," she whispered. "Everyone laughed. At my dress, at the fact that I was alone. They said I'm weird, that no one wants me." Edward felt anger burn in his chest. Children could be cruel, he knew. But Olivia had already suffered so much. She didn't deserve this too. "I want you," he said firmly. "I care. It's about you. And I'm going to make this stop, Olivia. You won't suffer anymore, I promise." But Olivia shook her head, still clutching the teddy bear tightly. "Everyone makes promises. My parents promised they'd never leave me. Grandma Carmen promised she'd take care of me. Aunt Sandra promised she'd give me a home, but everyone breaks promises." Edward knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in his. "I know you have no reason to trust me. I know you've been let down many times, but I'm not like the others. I won't break my promise. I'll do whatever it takes to protect you." Olivia looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide if she could believe him. Then, slowly, she released one hand from the teddy bear and touched Edward's face, as if to confirm he was real. "Why are you different?" she asked in a fragile voice. Edward took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Because you made me feel again. For many years I lived like a robot. I worked, earned money, fulfilled obligations. But I felt nothing. It was easier that way. Not feeling means not suffering, but it also means not truly living. And then I saw you in your pink dress with your sad eyes, and something inside me woke up. You reminded me that there's something more important than protecting my heart. There's using my heart to protect those who need it." Tears began to stream down Olivia's face again, but this time they were different. They weren't tears of despair, but of relief. As if she had been alone for so long that she had forgotten what it was like to have someone genuinely by her side. "I drew you," she confessed softly, "in my drawings. An outstretched hand with a ring like yours. I didn't know your name, but I knew you were there, watching. And I wanted you to save me, but I was afraid to believe that anyone actually would." Edward hugged the girl, feeling her tremble in his arms. She was so small, so fragile, yet so strong for having survived so much. "I'm going to save you," he whispered. "Starting today, everything will change." And it was at that moment that Sandra entered the room. She looked different. She no longer had her usual elegant composure. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and there was a poorly disguised glimmer of panic in her eyes. "You," she pointed at Edward with a trembling finger, "you're ruining everything." Edward stood up, placing himself between Sandra and Olivia. "The only one ruining anything here is you. Ruining an innocent child's life." Sandra laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Innocent? You don't understand anything. This girl is a walking inheritance. Millions in trust funds, properties, investments. And I worked hard to get her guardianship to access all of it." "So you admit it," Edward said calmly, though inside he was seething with rage. "You admit you're using an orphan child to steal her inheritance. It's not stealing if I'm her legal guardian. The courts gave me that right." a right you obtained through manipulation and lies, by removing her true guardian, Grandma Carmen, through a false medical diagnosis, infiltrating your brother into companies to divert funds, willfully neglecting Olivia to keep her vulnerable and unable to question your actions. Sandra turned pale. You can't prove any of that. Edward smiled, but it was a cold smile. Yes, I can. I have testimonies, recordings, bank records, witnesses. And I have Mrs. Carmen herself, who is perfectly lucid and ready to testify against you. Seeing she was cornered, Sandra changed tactics. Her expression softened, her eyes filled with false tears. Edward, please, you don't understand. I was a victim too. I was in debt, desperate. I saw an opportunity and took it. But I can change. I can treat Olivia better. Just don't report me. Don't take away everything I've built. It was a convincing performance. But Edward was not fooled. You had 2 years to treat Olivia better. 2 years in which she suffered at your hands. 2 years in which you neglected her, emotionally, abused her, used her for your own ends. There is no second chance for someone who does that to a child. Sandra wiped away her false tears, and her face transformed into a mask of hatred. You'll regret this. I have lawyers. I have connections. I'll destroy you. You can try, Edward replied calmly. But while you're making empty threats, I've already contacted my lawyers and child protective services. They're on their way now. As if on cue, voices sounded from the corridor. They were 2 social workers from Child Protective Services, accompanied by a police officer. Sandra tried to run, but the police officer stopped her. The social workers immediately approached Olivia, kneeling beside her gently. Hi, sweetie. My name is Julia, and this is Roderick. We're here to help you. Everything's all right now. Olivia looked from Julia to Edward, still scared but with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Edward said he would save me, she whispered. He promised. And he kept his promise, Julia smiled. You're going to be okay, see? We're taking you to a safe place while all this gets sorted out. Edward approached and knelt again in front of Olivia. You'll go with these people now. They are good people who will take care of you. I'll sort everything out and soon you'll be with your Grandma Carmen, who loves you and has always wanted to be with you. And you? Olivia asked, clutching his hand. Are you leaving too? Edward felt his eyes sting. I'll never completely leave. I'll stay here looking after you, ensuring you're safe and happy. You might not live with me, but you'll always have a place in my heart. Always. Olivia hugged him tightly, and Edward reciprocated, feeling something inside him heal in that embrace. Years of emotional coldness, of distance, of excessive protection, all dissolved in that moment of genuine connection. When he finally let her go, Olivia went with the social workers. She looked back several times as she walked, and each time Edward waved, assuring her that he was still there. Sandra was taken for questioning. She screamed, she threatened, but there was nothing more she could do. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Patricia approached Edward, emotional. You really did it. You saved that girl. Edward shook his head. She saved me. She reminded me of what truly matters in life. In the weeks that followed, Edward worked tirelessly to ensure Olivia had the best possible outcome. He hired the best lawyers to prosecute Sandra for fraud, emotional abuse, and child neglect. He worked with social workers to ensure Mrs. Carmen was properly evaluated and had her mental capacity recognized. He visited Olivia regularly at the temporary shelter where she was, bringing books, toys, but most importantly, his presence. With each visit, he saw Olivia slowly transforming. The dark circles under her eyes disappeared. Her skin regained color. Her smile, previously non-existent, began to appear timidly. She still had nightmares, still had moments of anxiety and fear, but she was healing. Sandra was convicted. She had to return all the funds diverted from Olivia's inheritance, lost guardianship, and was prohibited from approaching the girl. Brian was also investigated and faced legal consequences for corporate fraud. Grandma Carmen was officially recognized as mentally capable and was granted guardianship of Olivia. The day they were finally reunited was one of the most emotional in Edward's life. He was there when Olivia saw her grandmother for the first time in 2 years. The girl ran into Carmen's arms, and the two embraced for long minutes, crying, with joy and relief. It was a moment of pure emotion, of healing, of new beginnings. "Thank you," Carmen said to Edward, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you for not giving up on my granddaughter when everyone else did." "I could never give up on her," Edward replied honestly. Carmen decided to return to her home in the countryside, where Olivia could have a quieter life, away from the painful memories of Manchester. Edward helped them with the move, ensuring they had everything they needed to start anew. On the day of their departure, Olivia held Edward's hand. "Will you visit me?" she asked, and in her voice there was no longer the fear of abandonment, but only the genuine hope of maintaining the bond. "Yes, I will. Every week, if you like. And you can call me whenever you need to, whenever you want to talk." Olivia smiled, that smile Edward had worked so hard to see. "I made a new drawing for you," she said, handing him a folded sheet of paper. Edward opened it and felt his heart clench. The drawing showed 2 figures holding hands, one large and one small. Behind them, a bright yellow sun, and in the corner, written in childlike but careful handwriting, "Thank you for saving me when I couldn't save myself." Edward hugged Olivia, allowing himself to cry for the first time in decades. They were tears of sadness for all she had suffered, but also of joy at seeing that she was finally safe, loved, with a future ahead of her. "You are very brave, Olivia," he whispered, "braver than any adult I know." "And you are very good," she replied, "even when you pretend you're not." Edward smiled through his tears. That girl knew him better than he knew himself. After Olivia and Carmen left, Edward returned to his apartment in Didsbury, but it was no longer the same empty and impersonal place as before. Now there were photos of Olivia on the walls. Her drawings hung on the refrigerator, reminders that he was no longer alone, that he had a greater purpose than simply accumulating wealth. He changed his company too. He created a social responsibility program focused on vulnerable children. He hired social workers, forged partnerships with shelters, established funds for the education of orphans. He used his influence and resources to make a difference. But none of this was out of obligation or for show. It was because Olivia had taught him that closing one's heart to avoid suffering also means closing one's heart to joy, to love, to everything that makes life meaningful. Every Saturday, Edward drove to the small town in rural Cheshire where Olivia lived with Carmen. He spent the day with them, listening to Olivia's stories about her new school, the friends she was making, the dreams she was starting to have again. Mrs. Carmen treated him like family. She said he was an angel disguised as a serious businessman. Edward laughed, but deep down he felt it was the opposite. He was a man who had been lost, and a 9-year-old girl had found him. On one of these visits, 6 months after Olivia had moved in with her grandmother, she handed him another drawing. This time, it showed 3 figures. One was Carmen, clearly identifiable by her white hair. Another was Olivia, in a new, colorful and beautiful dress. And the third was Edward, drawn with an immense heart in his chest. "That's you," Olivia explained, "with a big heart because you used your heart to save me." Edward framed that drawing and hung it on his office wall. On difficult days, when the pressure of work overwhelmed him, he would look at that drawing and remember what truly mattered. Years passed. Olivia grew up, becoming an intelligent and sensitive teenager. She still carried emotional scars from what she had lived through, still attended therapy, still had bad days, but she was alive, she was growing, she was becoming the person she deserved to be. And Edward was there for every important milestone: her primary school graduation, her first school play performance, her 15th birthday. Always present, always supportive, always reminding her that she was not alone. Carmen used to say he was like a father to Olivia, but Edward knew it was more complex than that. He was a guardian, a protector, a friend, a father figure, all rolled into one. He was someone who had been transformed by the love of a child he saved, but who had in fact saved him first. One Sunday night, Edward was in his apartment when he received a call from Olivia. She was crying, but it wasn't the crying of pain he had witnessed years ago. It was the crying to have someone emotional, happy. "Edward, I did it. I got the scholarship for that college I wanted. I'll be able to study for free at one of the best schools in the county." Edward felt pride swell in his chest. "I always knew you could do it. You are brilliant, Olivia." "But I wouldn't have done it without you," she said, her voice still trembling. "Without the therapy you paid for, without the books you gave me, without believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. You changed my life, and you changed mine," Edward replied honestly. "You taught me that it's worth feeling even if it sometimes hurts, that it's worth caring even if it's scary, that it's worth using your heart even if it means risking it getting hurt." Olivia laughed through her tears. "Look at us, exchanging life lessons. I was the child, remember? And you still are, at least to me, but a child who grew into an incredible person." After they hung up, Edward stood looking out the window at the illuminated city of Manchester below. He thought about how his life had changed since that morning years ago when he first saw a girl in a pink dress walking alone. He thought about how he almost ignored that impulse to stop and observe, how he almost kept driving, maintaining his perfect and emotionally sterile routine, how he almost let Olivia suffer alone because getting involved seemed too dangerous. But he didn't, and that decision, that moment of choosing to feel instead of protecting himself, had changed everything. Edward was no longer the cold and calculating man he once was. He was still successful, still ran his company competently, but now there was warmth in his life, there was purpose, there was love, and all because of a girl in a pink dress, with sad eyes that silently begged to be seen. He had seen her. He had answered the silent call. And in saving her, he had saved himself too. Because in the end, Edward discovered that night, as he looked at the city lights, saving someone and being saved by someone are sometimes the same thing. They are two sides of a single act of love, of courage, of humanity. And he was grateful, profoundly grateful, for having had the opportunity to experience both. 3 years had passed since that transformative day. At school, Edward Burton, now 45, looked out his office window and smiled at the framed photo on his desk. It was Olivia, at 12, wearing a new, colourful blue dress, genuinely smiling, with her arms around Grandma Carmen. The difference between that radiant girl and the ragged pink-dressed child he had known was like night and day. But the path to get there hadn't been simple. Edward had learned that saving someone is just the beginning. The real journey lies in helping that person rebuild themselves piece by piece, day after day. In the first few months after Olivia's move to the countryside, Edward religiously kept his promise to visit her every week. On Saturdays, he woke early, hit the road, and drove to the small town of Wilmslow, where Carmen had bought a cozy house with a garden. It was a peaceful place, far from the painful memories of Manchester, perfect for a girl who needed to relearn to trust the world. The first visits were challenging. Olivia was still fragile, frightened by any change in routine, any loud sound, any abrupt gesture. She woke in the middle of the night with nightmares, dreaming that Sandra was coming, back to take her away. She had difficulty accepting that this new reality was permanent, that no one would take away the security she had finally achieved. Edward vividly remembered one morning, about 2 months after the move, when he arrived for his weekly visit and found Olivia sitting in the garden, completely still, staring into space. Carmen was worried. "She's been like this since last night," the elderly woman explained in a tired voice. "Doesn't want to eat, doesn't want to talk, just sits there, lost in her thoughts." Edward approached slowly and sat on the bench beside Olivia, respecting her silence. They remained like that for long minutes, just sharing the space. Then, Olivia finally spoke, her voice small and frightened. "What if all this is just a dream? What if I wake up and I'm still in that house, with that woman?" Edward felt his heart clench. He gently took her hand. "This isn't a dream, Olivia. It's real. You are safe. You are with your grandmother who loves you. And I'm here too. I'll keep coming every week, I'll keep looking after you. That won't change. But what if you get tired of me? What if one day you realize I'm too much trouble, too difficult, and decide I'm not worth it? Edward turned to face her directly. Olivia, look at me. You're not problematic. You're a child who went through terrible things and is learning to trust again. That takes time, and I have all the time in the world. I won't give up on you, never. Olivia began to cry, and Edward hugged her, letting her break down in his arms. She cried for all she had lost, for all she had suffered, but also for the relief of finally having someone who wouldn't leave, who wouldn't abandon her when things got difficult. That was a crucial moment in their relationship. After that day, Olivia truly began to trust. She began to believe that Edward was different, that his promises carried weight, that she wasn't alone. Therapy helped a great deal. Edward had hired Manchester's best child psychologist, Dr. Helen Morris, a 50-year-old woman specializing in child trauma. She conducted weekly sessions with Olivia, working through art therapy and conversational techniques to help the girl process everything she had experienced. Dr. Helen explained to Edward that the road would be long. Olivia suffered prolonged emotional abuse during crucial formative years. This doesn't heal overnight. She will have relapses, she will have difficult moments, but with consistent support, unconditional love, and proper therapy, she can fully recover. And she was recovering, slowly but consistently. Edward saw the changes with each visit. The smile that was once non-existent began to appear timidly. Nightmares decreased in frequency. The girl who used to draw only dark images began to create colorful, vibrant art. One day, Olivia showed him a new drawing. It was a garden full of flowers, with colorful butterflies flying around. In the center, 3 figures, holding hands, her, Carmen, and Edward. This is my new world, she explained with a shy smile, a world where I can be happy. Edward framed that drawing and hung it on his office wall alongside the old dark drawings. It was important, he thought, to remember both where Olivia had come from and where she was going. The complete journey, not just the destination. But the transformation wasn't just Olivia's. Edward was also changing profoundly. The man who had spent decades avoiding emotional connections now found himself completely dedicated to a child's well-being. He reorganized his work schedule to never miss his Saturday visits. He began to learn about child development, about trauma, about how to be a consistent, supportive figure. His secretary, Mrs. Martha, a lady who had worked with him for 15 years, commented on the change one day. "Mr. Edward, with all due respect, you're different, lighter, more human." Edward laughed. "It's true, Martha. I think I spent so much time being a machine that I forgot how to be a person," Olivia reminded me. He also began to relate better to his employees. Before he was cold, distant, focused only on results. Now he asked about their families, cared about their personal problems, created better benefits in the company. The change was so remarkable that some old employees joked that he had been abducted by aliens and replaced by a kinder doppelganger. But Edward knew the truth. He hadn't been replaced. He had just finally allowed himself to be who he could have always been if he hadn't hidden behind emotional walls for so long. When Olivia turned 10, Edward organized a surprise party. He rented a space at a countryside club, hired entertainers, bought colorful decorations. He invited the new friends Olivia had made. At school, the teachers who supported her so much, and of course Patricia and her daughter Sophia, who occasionally visited her. Seeing Olivia surrounded by friends, laughing, playing, just being a normal child, was one of the most emotional moments in Edward's life. Carmen approached him during the party, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you for giving my granddaughter back to me, not just physically, but emotionally. You helped her become the joyful child she was before losing her parents." Edward shook his head. She was always strong, she just needed a safe space to blossom again. The party was a success. Olivia blew out the candles on her cake with a huge smile on her face, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her. It was everything a child deserved, and so different from the solitary birthdays she had spent under Sandra's guardianship. Speaking of Sandra, she had been sentenced to 3 years in prison for fraud and emotional abuse. Brian was also serving time for his corporate crimes. Edward occasionally received news through his lawyer about Sandra's attempts to contact Olivia, but all were blocked. There was a permanent restraining order protecting the girl. Olivia never asked about Sandra. It was as if that chapter of her life was so painful that she preferred simply not to revisit it. Dr. Helen said this was normal, part of the healing process. One day, when she was ready, perhaps Olivia would want to talk about it, but forcing her would be counterproductive. Edward completely respected that. He followed Olivia's lead, letting her control the pace of her own recovery. When Olivia entered adolescence, new challenges arose. She began to question her identity, to process the trauma she had experienced in a more mature way. There were moments of anger, of rebellion against the world that had allowed her to suffer so much. One afternoon during one of his visits, Olivia exploded. "Why, Edward? Why me? Why did I have to lose my parents? Why did I have to suffer at the hands of that terrible woman? What did I do to deserve all of this?" Edward didn't try to give easy answers or empty platitudes. He simply acknowledged her pain. "You did nothing to deserve it, Olivia. Nothing that happened was your fault. The world is sometimes unfair, even cruel. Bad things happen to good people for no reason, and that's horrible and unacceptable. But look where you are now. You survived. You're growing up strong, intelligent, kind despite everything. That's incredible." "But I shouldn't have to survive," Olivia cried. "I should have had a normal life with my parents without having to fight so hard just to exist. You're right. You deserved an easy, happy life without trauma, and it deeply pains me that you didn't have that. But I can't change the past. I can only be here now, helping to build a better future for you." Olivia cried a lot that day. Edward stayed by her side, letting her express all the anger and pain she had held inside. Dr. Helen later explained that this outburst was healthy, a necessary part of the grieving and acceptance process. Over time, Olivia began to channel her experiences creatively. She discovered a talent for writing and started writing stories about children who faced difficulties but found inner strength to overcome them. Edward read each story with pride, seeing how she was transforming her pain into something meaningful. When Olivia was 12, she won a school literary competition with a story about a girl who learned to fly after having her wings broken. The metaphor was clear, and Edward cried as he read her award-winning text. During the award ceremony, Olivia walked onto the stage to receive her trophy. She looked out at the audience, found Edward sitting beside Carmen, and dedicated the award. "I want to thank my grandmother for giving me a home full of love, and Edward, who taught me that even when we think we're too broken to fix, there's always someone willing to hold the pieces until we can put ourselves back together." Edward had to discreetly leave the auditorium because he couldn't stop crying. That girl, whom he had known so broken, so lost, was now shining. And knowing that he had been a part of that transformation was the most gratifying thing he had ever experienced. Carmen found him outside, also emotional. "She sees you as a father, you know," the elderly woman said gently. Edward wiped away his tears. "And I see her as the daughter I never knew I wanted to have." It was an important moment of recognition. For 3 years, Edward had avoided defining exactly what his role in Olivia's life was. He wasn't her biological father, nor her legal adoptive father. But it was something equally important. It was choice. Olivia had chosen him as a father figure, and he had chosen her as his daughter of the heart. After that conversation, Edward began to consider something he had been thinking about for months. What if he made it official? What if he formally adopted Olivia, becoming co-legal guardian alongside Carmen? He spoke with Carmen first, nervous about how she would react. "Mrs. Carmen, I know you are Olivia's grandmother, her legal guardian, and I would never want to take that away from you, but I would like to know if you would consider a co-guardianship, where I would also have legal responsibility for Olivia, not to replace you, but to complement." Carmen held his hands tightly. "Edward, I'm 73 years old. I don't know how much time I have left on this earth. And the thing that worries me most is what will happen to Olivia when I'm no longer here. Knowing that you would be legally responsible for her would give me immense peace." Then they talked with Olivia. Edward was nervous, not knowing how she would react to the proposal. "Olivia, I have something important to ask. I know you already have your grandmother who loves you very much, but I would like to officially become your guardian as well. Through a legal co-guardianship, this means I would be, in a way, like a father to you, not replacing your true parents, but being a new paternal figure in your life. What do you think about that?" Olivia was silent for a moment, processing. Then, slowly, a huge smile spread across her face. "You're already like a father to me, Edward. You have been for a while. I was just waiting for you to realize it." Edward laughed through his tears and hugged Olivia tightly. Carmen joined the embrace, and the three stood there, an unconventional but deeply connected family, built not by blood, but by choice and by love. The legal process took a few months, but was eventually approved. Edward Burton officially became Olivia Scott's co-guardian. He added her name to his will, created an educational fund to ensure she could study whatever she wanted, and began to include her in all important aspects of his life. Olivia began spending school holidays at Edward's apartment in Didsbury. He transformed one of the rooms into a special space for her, letting her decorate it as she wished. Olivia chose sunny yellow walls, shelves full of books, a large desk where she could draw and write. That room became her refuge when she visited the city, and Edward loved having her presence there, filling the previously empty apartment with laughter, conversations, life. One night, during one of these holiday visits, Olivia was having trouble sleeping. Edward heard her stirring in her room and gently knocked on the door. "May I come in?" Olivia was sitting on the bed, hugging a pillow. "I had a nightmare. About her, about Sandra." Edward sat on the edge of the bed. "Do you want to talk about it?" Olivia shook her head. "It's not about what she did. It's about the fear that one day you'll realize I'm too much work, too complicated, and send me away too." Edward felt his heart break. Even after 3 years, even with all the therapy and all the love, Olivia still carried that deep fear of abandonment. "Olivia, listen to me closely. You will never, ever be too much work. You are not complicated, you are human. And humans are complex. They have difficult moments. They need support. That's normal. And I never ever send you away. You are my daughter now officially, and that is forever. Even when I grow up and become an adult, especially when you grow up, I'll be there when you graduate from high school. I'll be there when you go to college. I'll be there at your wedding if you decide to marry. I'll be there when you have your own children if you want to. I'll always be there, Olivia. Because you're not just a responsibility to me. You are joy. You are purpose. You are love." Olivia threw herself into his arms, crying, but this time they were tears of relief, of gratitude, of reciprocated love. Edward stayed with her until she fell asleep, holding her hand as he used to when she was younger. And as he watched her sleep peacefully, he thought about how drastically his life had changed. 3 years ago, he was an empty man, rich in money, but poor in human connections. Now he had a daughter, a family, a purpose that went beyond profits and spreadsheets. He had love. And he discovered each day that giving love was far more gratifying than protecting his heart. His professional life had also been transformed. Edward's company was now known not only for its successful real estate ventures, but also for its social responsibility. The program he had created for vulnerable children had already helped dozens of families. Edward donated generously, but more importantly, he donated his time and attention. He frequently visited shelters, talked with children in difficult situations, used his story with Olivia to inspire other businessmen to get socially involved. He became a passionate advocate for children's rights, working with NGOs and governmental bodies to improve child protection systems. Patricia Miller, who had been crucial in helping him save Olivia, became a partner in this work. Together they created a foundation called Extended Hands, focused on identifying and helping children in situations of abuse or neglect. The foundation trained teachers, offered legal support to families who wanted to report suspicious cases, and provided resources for children who had been removed from abusive environments. All of this was born from that morning, when Edward saw a girl in a pink dress and decided not to look away. One Saturday afternoon, Edward and Olivia were in Carmen's garden, painting together. Olivia had developed a love for art, and Edward, who had never picked up a paintbrush in his life, was learning from her. Both were terrible, but they laughed a lot at their crooked paintings and clashing colors. "Edward, can I ask you a question?" Olivia said suddenly, focused on adding red flowers to her painting. "Of course, always. Do you regret it? Getting involved with me? Changing your whole life because of me?" Edward stopped painting and looked at her seriously. "Olivia, getting involved with you was the best decision I've ever made in my life. Before you, I existed, but I didn't live. I had everything and I had nothing. You gave me purpose, you gave me love, you gave me a reason to wake up in the morning beyond just earning more money. Never, not for a second, have I regretted it." Olivia smiled, that genuine smile that now came so easily. "Good. Because I also never regretted drawing you in that picture with the ring. I guess some part of me already knew you were going to save me." Edward felt his eyes sting. He took her hand, the same small hand that years ago was, so fragile and frightened, now stronger, more confident. "We saved each other, Olivia, you as much as I." And it was true. Because while Edward had taken Olivia out of a horrible situation, given her security and love, Olivia had taken Edward out of an emotional prison he had built himself. She had taught him to feel again, to trust again, to love again. On that sunny afternoon, painting bad pictures and laughing together in the garden, Edward finally understood what it meant to be complete. It wasn't about having everything. It was about having what truly mattered. And what mattered was right there beside him. A 12-year-old girl with paint on her hands and light in her eyes. His daughter, his purpose, his heart outside his chest. Olivia Scott, the girl in the pink dress who once walked alone through the streets, now walked with her head held high, surrounded by love. And Edward Burton, the businessman who once feared to feel, now lived with an open heart, vulnerable, but infinitely richer for it. They had found each other when both needed saving, and together they had built something beautiful from suffering. They had transformed pain into love, trauma, into healing, loneliness into family. And they would continue walking together, father and daughter of the heart, proving that sometimes the best families are not the ones we are born into, but the ones we choose to build.